Well, hello there. It turns out the video that I made where the camera froze up that I was trying to upload, the upload actually failed. I mentioned that video in the previous video that did actually work. And I don't know what's going on with my camera, but it was maybe a 3 minute long video, but it registered as being 77 minutes long. So I don't know what happened there. The camera froze up, and there's Rocky. He's mauling me here, as you can see. Hey, how you doing, my cat? You're a good boy. Anyway, it registered at 77 minutes long, so I don't know. Um, it's funny. I was talking there. I'm my fingers in the video. If you watch the previous video, you know what I'm talking about. I put my hand in front of the camera when I had it zoomed in at the window to point something out, and my fingers were huge, and I kind of got onto that and telling the story about how I broke my fingers working in a wire factory in 1985. And it's funny, it brought to mind something years ago when I was living in the apartment downtown above the bank in Perth, in an old stone building. It brought to mind something. Being up there, I used to hear a lot of stuff coming from the street. I used to hear conversations and stuff. And I remember one time there were these two young guys walking down the street. They'd only be teenagers, I'm sure, at the time. And they were talking about the 1980s. And, of course, they weren't alive in the 80s. But they were talking about the 1980s, and they were saying, oh, yeah, that was just a party time. Everybody was it was great. It was just a big party time, And it's funny because for me, being an old guy, of course, I lived in the 80s. I was the age that they were when they were having that conversation in the 1980s. I turned 12 in 1980. So the 1980s were literally my teen years, and my very early adulthood, too, was the 1980s. The late 1980s was my early adulthood. I turned 20 in 1988. I turned 18 in 1986. So I remember the 1980s really well. And they were kind of right. It was a party time. I remember field parties and house parties and everything, and that did happen. And fortunately, in my circle of friends, we weren't into drugs. There was a crowd that was into drugs, but that wasn't us. My circle of friends was big into alcohol. And I'll tell you, they'd drink until they puked. I wasn't a drinker myself, and I always had some beat-up old car, so I would be the designated driver. I was the guy that had to pull over to let somebody out so they could puke on the side of the road. Or so they could take a pee on the side of the road or whatever. That was my job. To make sure that all the bodily fluids went onto the side of the road and not into my back seat, or whatever. Because I didn't want to have to deal with that mess in my car. But I remember one time we went to this one guy's house. It was a friend of ours. And his parents had a 1965 Pontiac Parisienne. And the car was off the road. It had been off the road for 2 or 3 years. And we decided we're going to get this thing running. And we did, too. We worked at it, and we got the old car running. And then we decided it was tour time. Now, I had an old car of my own that was on the road, but of course, where's the fun in that when you can do something illegal? So we get into this old 65 Pontiac Parisienne, and we bomb her down the road there. I remember the brake pedal was practically on the floor. There was hardly any brakes or anything. And we ended up driving 12 miles to the neighboring town of Smiths Falls. And we arrived in Smiths Falls late at night. And the only place that was open we could find was a Chinese restaurant. And of course, by that time, all my friends were half in the bag. This was back, around 1986, I guess, 85, 86, in there. Anyway, we go into this Chinese restaurant. Now, I've got this car parked outside, this big old Pontiac Parisienne, with license plates that expired like in 1984. And it's now in 1986 or something, The her car hasn't been on the road in a couple of years. It isn't insured. If anything had happened, it would have been an awful nightmare. But you do stupid things when you're young. Anyway, we go in there, and we're in the Chinese restaurant, and unfortunately, my friends got kind of obnoxious with the Chinese fella that was working in there. They started being a little bit racist, I guess, and he called the police on us. So I remember having to usher them out. Anyway, my phone's going to run out of time, so I'm going to stop. I'll upload this, and I'll continue my story anyway in the next video.